I'm so happy to welcome you all to this last session of the webinars from Konkan to Coromandel that the Deccan Heritage Foundation has organized in collaboration with Cambridge University and the Islamic Center, as well as Bangalore International Center. I would also, the co-hosts of this series were, except for myself, I'm Helen Phelan, and it was Vivek Gupta from Cambridge, and we were also very happy to have amongst our advisors Marika Sardar. Today is the last lecture of the fourth session of the seminars from Konkan to Coromandel. And I think we have introduced in this session a lot of new subject matters, as well as new ideas. And I think Arthur's lecture today is part of this exciting new approach to the tile work of the Deccan, of which we know very, very little. There are many examples we have, all of which are different. We have underglazed painted techniques, we have mosaic techniques, we have all sorts of techniques. Some of them are exquisitely done, others less so, but they all display and depict a series of possibilities and contexts that the Deccan had, and of which we know really very little. So though we have a lot of examples, the tile work and the ceramics that we see on these amazing buildings that we have from both the Bahmani and the succeeding Sultanate period are very ambiguous. We don't know where they were made, by whom, as we have no kilns or any other material to show us who were the people that worked on these motifs and on these designs and on these techniques, which echo different traditions from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. I think that Arthur is the person that can really approach this subject with the wide knowledge that he has of ceramics, of Islamic ceramics, as Arthur was both a consultant in Islamic, Indian, Himalayan, and Southeast Asian art in London. And he studied at Queen's College and so as University of London. He started his career at Sotheby's, and later, and now he advises collectors and auction rooms, as well lecturing and writing on the ceramics and the tile work of Asia. And he has written 2 books, The Damascus Tiles, which is a wonderful compilation of his amazing knowledge on ceramics and their techniques. And most recently, he has really written the only book that we have on Indian tiles. As there's a lot to talk about, I would like to ask Arthur to start his lecture, as I think he has much more to say than I do. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you we hope to continue these webinars in next autumn, when you will have had the time to consider all the new material that we have presented these last 4 sessions. Thank you. Thank you, Arthur.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen, and thank you to the Deccan Heritage Foundation. And I'm very honoured to be in the presence of so many real academics, unlike me, who's more of a sort of interested amateur. But I'm just going to share the screen now. Well, it's fair to say that there's been very little awareness of this area of art history in the subcontinent. And it's not just the Deccan, but tiles generally in India have been very much overlooked. What little attention there has been rather more centred on the Mughals. And I think really this is a pity. I mean, I think it's a pity that the tiles have been neglected generally, but the tiles of the Deccan, I think, are particularly interesting and particularly high quality and particularly varied. The problem, of course, is very little remains in situ, and there's almost nothing in Western museums. So there's very little that's stimulated the interest. But what I want to try and do today is probably pose more questions than I answer. But I want to give an idea of the distinctive features which set these tiles apart from other Islamic tiles across the world, and acknowledge all the external input that we see from Anatolia, Central Asia, and Iran, but also the things that make them particularly Indian and particularly Deccani. So we're just starting off now with the facade, the rather glorious facade of the tomb of Alauddin Bahmani in Bidar. And you can see here both the pluses and the minuses of studying Deccani tiles. The great quality of the painting shines through, but also the losses and the problems with deterioration over time, which are really quite extreme in the Deccan and in the Indian subcontinent generally. So that's as by way of introduction, but I want to just move on to, and I don't seem to be able to advance my slide. I wanted just to start, in fact, by showing some examples of other tiles from elsewhere on the subcontinent, just to give you an idea of the context. And on the top left, we've got a view of the tiled facade of the tomb of Bibi Jawindi in Ooch in Pakistani Punjab. And this is, of course, probably the best known type of tile that you get from the subcontinent, and things that probably people are more aware of than anything else. Underglaze painted blue and white tiles, and very distinctive style on red earthenware. And on the right, we've got just a little fragment of cut tile mosaic from the Mosque of Dayanga in Lahore. And this is something which is particularly associated with the Punjab, but as we'll see in a minute, cut tile mosaic most certainly does feature in the Deccan. Bottom left, we've got a tile probably from Tatar in Sindh, underglaze painted blue and white. And then in the middle, a rather unusual tile from Mandu, from the younger sister's tomb, early 16th century. And then a very typical Mughal tile from the Shah Jahan period, probably from the tomb of Madani in Kashmir, in Srinagar, with those very distinctive colours, which we associate with Mughal Quetta Secca tiles. Now, I just want to briefly talk about the techniques, because there are certain techniques which feature both across India and Islamic world, and also in the Deccan. Underglaze painting is is quite simple to describe. It's basically painting on a white slip with a transparent glaze covering it. I mean, a lot of you probably are very familiar with these techniques, but just in case not, Quetta Secca tiles, which you don't really see in the Deccan, but just so you know when I'm referring to it, the glaze is applied directly, but the colours are separated by a black line of a sort of manganese composition, which keeps the colours apart. And actually with Kashmir tiles, it's quite unusual to see, unlike the Persian ones, you get a slight shading of colour within the areas of pigments, so that you get a slightly more subtle sense of depth. And then on the right, we've got a very typical tile from Sultanate Bengal from the 15th century. And here it's rather like Quetta Secca, but the colours they're not actually divided, but they do manage to keep apart, but the colours are painted directly onto the clay. So that's just by way of a little bit of background. So let's think a little bit about the origins of tiles in the Deccan. And this, of course, is right on the northwestern fringes of the Deccan, Daulatabad, the Chand Minar. Now, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about the dating of this building, and I'm not going to get terribly involved in the controversy about that, but it's very likely that that this building was as Mohit Manohar suggested last year, that it was built all together as one thing, because earlier scholars were suggesting that the minaret came first and then the building. But the point is the tiles appear on both sections of the building. And I think these are probably an indication of the type of tiles which were first seen in the Deccan. Now, this building's dated mid-14th century. Mid-15th century, and it's probably a sort of carry on from earlier styles. There are some quite similar plain blue tiles on the tomb of Muhammad II in Gulbarga, dated 1398, and I think those are probably the earliest tiles we know of in the Deccan. But this type of very plain tile is much more linked to the sort of tiles we get in Sultanate Delhi, and it didn't really continue. And quite extraordinarily, when Bidar finally became the capital of the Bahmani Sultanate in the 1430s, we get this very sophisticated appearance, which comes apparently from nowhere. And I think obviously we've got to bear in mind the input of the cosmopolitan influence of people such as the people at court, such as Mahmud Gawan. And there was a very international crowd there, and some of the inscriptions clearly make it obvious that Persians and foreigners were involved there. These designs are there's no real precedent, and there's nothing really to see where they're coming from in a local context. But if we just go on now to look, some of the best tiles on this on Alauddin's tomb are and best preserved are actually in the arch soffits here, and I'm just showing them alongside two other images to give you an idea of the sort of stylistic inspiration. Although, of course, you can tell that they're actually not at all the same, and the Deccan tiles are very distinctive, but you can see the same sort of leaf designs here on this building in Afghanistan, in Iran. This is the sorry, I'm getting so muddled with all these slide things, but this is the Darb-e Alam, Isfahan, and on the right, the Friday Mosque in Yazd, both from the mid 15th century, and you can see the sort of leaf and flower forms, which very much echo the designs on the Bahmani tiles. But in fact, the crucial difference is that the Bahmani tiles are underglaze painted, and the Persian ones are cut tile mosaic. So it's quite surprising and strange that at this date we've got underglaze painted tiles, which you do seem to spring out of nowhere. And although they're following the designs of the Timurids, they're not following the technique. I mean, as I said, we do see cut tile mosaic at a later date, and I'm just showing at the top there a detail of a Yuan vase in the V&A, which shows this same sort of lotus leaf design, which you've got there and there. But that gives you an idea of the very sort of mixed heritage of these tiles. Oh, good! It actually changed the slide. This is just a sort of closer up image of one of these tiles, a fragment that's obviously dropped or been pulled off the Alauddin tomb, and thanks to Helen Filon for sending me this image. But what I want to show particularly is the fabric underneath. You can see it's this sort of whitish material, which is a composition known as fritware, which is very commonly seen across the rest of the Islamic world. And this is the material used in almost all of the tiles in the Deccan. Although I say that, but quite a lot of analysis and research still needs to be done on the materials. And a lot of this I'm just assuming from personal observation and examination of these tiles. But I mean, for people who aren't aware of the definition of fritware, it's a composition of only about 10% clay, and the rest of it is a silica sand-like mix from ground down quartz. And this is a technology not seen in the Indian subcontinent before this period, and simultaneously in the Deccan and in the Sultanate in the north, it started increasingly being used for tiles, but not exclusively. But the other type of fabric, as we've already mentioned, is in the Indus Valley and also in Bengal, which is just the simple red earthenware. And we've got a slightly confusing picture, which we'll come to in a minute, about the mixture of different materials in the Deccan. And here's another group of tiles in the fort, in the Diwan-i-Am, which sadly no longer exists. These images are taken from Yazdani's important work on Bidar, published in 1947. And you can see here on the left, you can see some images of tile panels still in situ. And although the panels are still there, the frames are still there, the actual tiles have sadly long since gone. There are two things to say here about the colours, which are quite interesting. First of all, on the right, you can see there are little flashes of red pigment, which is a very rare and very difficult colour to achieve in Fahd ceramics. And of course, the best known use of red is in the sort of classical Ottoman Iznik pottery and tiles, but it hardly appears elsewhere. You do see it on Minai pottery in Seljuk times, but that's slightly different, painted on top of the surface and Fahd subsequently, whereas the glazing in underglaze, when you've got the red, is the very difficult thing to achieve. Now, I have wondered whether perhaps these plates being hand painted were perhaps mistaken and or exaggerated the colour. Maybe it was just a brown, but in fact, Yazdani does mention in his text that the colour red does appear. And in fact, there are a few fragments. I've seen some little pieces which Helen Filon's shown me from the store in the museum, admittedly not underglaze painted, but little patches of red cut tile mosaic, just fragments in the museum. But probably the best known architectural structure in Bidar is the madrasa of Mahmud Gawan, built in the 1470s, and it's today only just a fragment, and you can see on the plan there, taken from Yazdani, that we're just looking at the right-hand half of the facade. But there are some very spectacular tiles high up, probably where they couldn't so easily be reached by people wanting to pick them off the walls. But quite apart from the the quality of the mosaic work and the inventiveness of the design. I mean, particularly the band here, which separates the main panels and window openings, is unlike anything seen in tile work elsewhere, both in terms of colour and design. But I've shown you on the right a detail because it's rather interesting. I was talking about the yellow and these yellow borders, which you do see throughout the 15th century. But you don't really get at this period yellow incorporated in the glaze. Just like the red, it's obviously provided. It obviously caused technical problems because we only really see yellow, and even then running slightly in the Baridi period in the 16th century. But what they have done here, they've inserted these lower tiles, which is this spandrel on the over the arch. The tiles are actually underglaze painted, but what they've done is cut out little spaces and inserted plain yellow pieces. So it's a sort of hybrid technique of underglaze painted and mosaic tiles, this is something very unusual, which it's unprecedented elsewhere in the Islamic world, and it's probably a practical solution to a technical difficulty, but rather inventive that they persisted and insisted on including yellow in the design. This is a detail of the minaret, and as you can see, it's got a very similar sort of band of inscription high up. I just really wanted to point out here that I think there's probably more to be revealed here. I don't know when this plaster was covered, but you can see when you look at it that this is not just loss of tile and weathering. You can see there the colour of the body of the tiles where it has weathered. But these bits look very much covered over. And I have a feeling that if anyone had the time or the funding to try and expose more of the colour, I'm sure there would be more hidden away, because it very much does look like a coating on top. But I'm just really basing this on what I can see from a distance. This sort of mixture of different tile types and media is something you see across Bidar, and this is the Shaza Darwaza built in 1503, I think, and it's got quite an interesting mixture of different tiles. There's this wonderful carved basalt inscription over the main entrance, and then above it you've got some very nice brightly coloured cut tile mosaic. And then you have the basalt inscription continues on either balcony in underglaze painted blue and white inscription. But then over on this side, there's a projecting loggia, which I hadn't actually, I have to admit, really had a good look at when I was there, but it's got some also interesting and unusual tiles. We've got hexagonal tiles, and I was wondering whether possibly these have been repositioned, because they do look slightly sort of jammed into the stonework there, but it's difficult to say. I mean, I think there's probably no reason to think that they were added later, but these tiles are not quite like anything else that appears in Bidar. There are some vaguely similar ones in the store in the museum. Down below, we've got some cut tile designs, which are slightly similar to the facade of Mahmud Gawan, and then some other polychrome tiles. Well, I think they're polychrome. There's a sort of pinkish color there, but it may, of course, just be where the glaze has dropped away. As I say, I didn't get a chance to look at these ones very closely. But I think these would definitely repay further study and research. The other interesting group of tiles is in the inside the fort in the Taj Mahal, and these are not underglaze painted; they're cut tile, but rather an interesting mixture of plain hexagonal tiles and then shaped what appear to be bricks. And we've got this this lion and sun emblem, and you can see on the right. Yazdani has sort of recreated, as he saw, in fact, the other side of the archway. And down below, this symbol of the lion and sun is something which, in more recent times, has been very much associated with sort of Persian national identity. But in fact, it does go back quite a long way to astrological treatises, which an example of which in the Bibliothèque Nationale is down at the bottom. But looking at these tiles, I think one thing, it looks as though we've got two different fabrics here. We've got what appears to be fritware hexagonal tiles, but mixed in with earthenware. Probably these look like earthenware bricks, which have been cut to shape. Because they definitely seem to have weathered differently and come out in different colours. But of course, it is possible that they're different batches. But again, it would be very interesting to see exactly what these tiles are made of. And you can just see on the right there some rather interesting cut brick and tile shapes. Of course, I say that a lot of the tiles have been lost, and in fact, we're really often just talking about the glaze that's been lost. And very often we can learn quite a lot just from the imprints of tiles. Certainly, they tell us, they're better than nothing. They do tell us quite a bit. And probably the best preserved building in the fort at Bidar is the Rangini Mahal, which was built around, it was built in phases added to, but most of this probably dates from the early Baridi period, the sort of beginning of the 16th century. But you see here this wonderful mixture of the carved wood in a very South Indian Dravidian style, and then this very sophisticated, beautifully made cut tile mosaic, and then the more of this carved basalt framing, which is very often used to frame panels of tiles, as we've seen already. This is the inside of the sort of inner chamber in the Rangini Mahal, and we've got some wonderful cut tile mosaic dados, and you can see on the right a comparison with the tiles in just outside Herat in Gazulgar. Similar, well, probably about 40 or 50 years earlier, but you can see some similar motifs and designs. And it's also just worth mentioning in passing the mother of pearl inlay in the basalt arch, which is thought to have inspired the well-known Bidri work, which is the silver inlaid black metal. But it's very likely it arose out of inspiration from this mother of pearl inlay work. And yes, I was saying that imprints can tell us a lot. This is one of the side chambers on the eastern end of the Rangini Mahal, and you can see again hexagonal tiles in a dado with borders above and below, and then this ogival medallion, very, very much Turkish inspired, and it's an example of this sort of very cosmopolitan input. I'll just show you here in Bursa. You can see very much the same arrangement with hexagonal tiles. Hexagonal tiles do seem to be, I don't know why, but hexagonal tiles across the Islamic world are very much favoured for treatment of dados. And in the Mamluk period, the sort of heyday of blue and white underglaze painted hexagonal tiles, very famous place, of course, in Damascus, the Ghaz al-Din Tarizi Mosque with hexagonal tiles in the dado. This is the green tomb in Bursa, dated 1421, and you can see the very clear parallels with the medallion in the middle of the hexagonal tiles. Now this is unfortunately another lot of tiles which I didn't manage to see at the time. The gate was firmly locked of the Tarkash Mahal when I was there. This is again a rather confusing building which has had alterations throughout the 16th century and possibly even later. But these rather interesting tiles, I think, show a further development. We can see the yellow separately fired yellow borders on either side, but more importantly, we've got yellow now appearing in the middle of the underglaze painted area. I say underglaze painted. I think these are underglaze, but of course I haven't really examined them closely. I think it would be very unlikely they're cuir de seca, because we don't really see cuir de seca tiles in this area, but it isn't impossible. But I've shown you up above, just to give an idea of the sort of inspiration from the green tomb in Bursa, these rather distinctive long petaled flowers, which you can see down here in this band of tiles. There's very little of this left, but they're sort of pretty much without parallel, apart from a few more fragments in the museum store. The other important tile, we're spending quite a lot of time on Bidar because I think these are really probably the most interesting tiles and the earliest ones in the Deccan, but we will be looking at other things later. But just to finish off with Bidar, the tomb of Ali Barid, which dates from the 1570s, we can see this tradition continuing. The late scholar Mark Zabrowski was slightly dismissive of these tiles, saying that they sort of perhaps rather poorly imitating Iznik prototypes, but I don't really think that's quite fair, because the quality of the underglaze painting is really pretty good. We've got to, of course, make allowances for all the bird and bat droppings, which are rather obscuring the picture. And in fact, even more so, if we peer up into the dome, we can see really a quite stunning array of tiles, but it's terribly difficult to look at because of the distance and the darkness, and also the fact that they're incredibly dirty. So, but you can see here this lower band, an absolute feast of floral forms, very densely packed and quite naturalistic, a bit more naturalistic perhaps than the tiles we've seen on some of the earlier buildings, such as Alauddin's tomb. But we can see that the artists were becoming a bit more adventurous. But it'd be very nice if someone at some stage could really look at these carefully and photograph them and clean them and examine them, because they really are quite stunning. And in fact, it's one of those things where I took photographs at the time, and then with a bit of manipulation and brightening the pictures, you discover a lot more long after you've left the site. So now we move on to Bidar and to Bijapur and the great mosque there, which was built around the same time as the Baridi tomb we were just looking at in the 1570s. Best known actually for the 17th century mihrab at the back, you can see on the left, but there are a few tiles which you can see arranged around this arch, and there are one or two other groups in the building. And I've got here a few close-ups of to show you what we're talking about. They're again cut tile, probably fritware, cut tile mosaic, a little bit more basic and a bit more crude perhaps than we've seen in Bidar, but still quite attractive, rather perhaps again a little bit more limited in range of color as well. There's really very little else to point out still in situ in Bijapur, but we do have some rather interesting fragments in the British Museum which raise a few questions. We've got, this is a sample of 3 of them, and on the left we've got, and I've shown the reverses below, we've got a fragment which must be quite closely allied to the tiles we were just looking at in the mosque, the same sort of plain yellow, probably part of a mosaic panel. And you can see the back of the tile, it's very much that whitish grey fritware material. But in the middle, we've got a rather different sort of tile, blue and white underglaze painted. And this is a red clay tile. You can see the bottom. These are all, they've all got Bijapur written on them. They came to the British Museum in the 19th century, but nothing's known about where they came from. And then on the right, we've got a blue and white underglaze painted fritware tile. And this is part of a group of about a dozen, I think about a dozen tiles. And it'd be really very interesting to know a little bit more about where they came from and how they were used. There are also hexagonal tiles, again, blue and white. And there's a bit of a clue here because the one on the left is red clay with a sort of international, what one might call international Timurid design. And the one on the right, very similar design, just a fragment, but made of fritware. But the tile on the left is actually very, very similar to tiles you see in Sindh. And I think we can be fairly certain that the red earthenware tiles were made in Tatar or thereabouts in the Indus region in Sindh. So the question is, how did they get there, and why do we see these 2 different materials? Well, to suggest an answer for the second question, I think probably most likely is however the tiles got to Bijapur, there weren't enough, and probably the local craftsmen made replicas with on the fritware body, which they were more familiar with, and to supplement the quantity. But I think that's probably seems the most likely explanation. As to how they got there, well, let's just have a look at some other ones. The tile on the left in the small images in the British Museum, and you can see identical tiles still in situ on Mackley Hill in Sindh. An anonymous tomb, ruined and extremely vulnerable looking tiles sitting there. And, I have to say, as someone in the commercial art world myself, it makes me feel very uncomfortable when I see tiles like this appearing in auction. And I think it's pretty clear where they've been coming from because you can see that they're disappearing bit by bit, and they're not really terribly well protected. So I was starting to ask a question about how they got to Bijapur. I think part of the clue may be Goa and the Portuguese. There are also some tiles which very clearly were made in Sindh in Goa, and none of them actually appear on buildings that can be of the same date as the likely date of the tiles. We've got on the left a photograph of the plinth of the statue of St. Francis Xavier in the Casa Professor, which is one of the buildings adjoining the Basilica of Bom Jesus. And this statue was made in the early 20th century. So the plinth and the tiles were put on the plinth, obviously, in relatively recent times. On the right, we've got the well-known convent of Santa Monica, where we've got these tiles, a mixture of different designs, some identical to examples found in Tatter, or at least found in Tatter and Mackley by Cousins when he was writing his, putting together his book, Portfolio of Sindh Tiles, at the beginning of the 20th century. But there are some other rather unusual designs, which I don't want to particularly go into that now because we're going to get a bit short of time. But there have been suggestions that these strange tree designs were commissions produced for the Portuguese because they're sort of Western looking, but I don't really see that. And I think I go into it a little bit more in my book, but there are some sort of similar designs and similar motifs, not quite the same, but I think just the fact that we haven't seen other tiles like this in Sindh today doesn't mean that they weren't originally made for local consumption in Sindh. Now, but what about the Portuguese? Well, I think one possible explanation is that the Portuguese sacked Tatter in, I think the date was 1556. And it is said that they plundered all sorts of things, and quite possibly including tiles. And until a few years ago, there were a lot of blue and white tiles in this Jesuit church in Bassein, just north of Mumbai. And there's nothing there today. I was very disappointed to find, but still a rather nice place to visit. But no tiles, sadly. But Cousins does mention blue and white tiles plundered from Sindh in this church. So I think it's probably most likely that the tiles used in Goa in a sort of Christian context were part of this plunder, and some of them ended up in this Portuguese enclave and the rest travelled on to Goa. And then maybe rather than being commercially imported to Bijapur, they just somehow found their way from Goa to Bijapur and were used there. The number of tiles, of course, as we've already said, is very small. So it doesn't look like the hexagonal blue and white tiles were part of a major decorative style seen in Bijapur. But we may be wrong. So much has been lost. So now we come on to the other main centre of power in the Deccan, Golconda and Hyderabad. And Golconda, of course, gave way to Hyderabad as the prosperity and peace increased in the Adil Shahi kingdom. But of course, Golconda was carried on to be used as a fortress, but also from our point of view, most interestingly, for the royal tombs. And work's going on the tombs at the moment. The Aga Khan Foundation is doing a lot of very good work restoring the buildings. But today you do get a rather false impression. You can see on the right, this is the tomb of Ibrahim, which just has that little patch of tiles, which you can see in the other image, a detail, rather beautiful tiles, but the rest of it is all just white plaster, and that's really the case with an awful lot of these tombs. Clearly they were all tiled because little fragments have been found, and indeed we'll be looking at in a minute. I think, yes, here we are. This is the tomb of, on the left, newly discovered fragments covered in plaster on the tomb of Kuli Shah. And then we can see on the right the tomb of Muhammad, which has got just tiny little fragments, really just enhancing the architecture, monochrome pieces, which probably are just the tip of the iceberg. And I'm very, very sure that it was ablaze with colour originally. So I think there is more to discover. And this brings us on to the matter of conservation, really, because it's obviously, in the past, the idea was just to keep the building standing and slap plaster on just to protect it. But it's a great shame that clearly a lot of these bits of decoration have been covered over. This is rather interesting, that a much later tomb, just a tiny little fragment, but it shows the Mughal influence. The colours are quite different, these sort of bright oranges and greens. And it's cut tile mosaic, but very much redolent of the Cuerda tiles of the Mughal era. I'm very much aware I'm slightly running out of time, but I must just show you the most glorious and best preserved tiles in Hyderabad, a terribly underappreciated site. I was amazed that it was very difficult to find anyone in Hyderabad who knew where this building, the Ashur Khana, was situated. And we were driving around for ages until it was found. It's terribly underappreciated site, and probably amongst the finest cut tile mosaics in India, beautifully put together. I'm going to just speed on very quickly, just to point out. I won't take up any more of the time, but just to point out two other things. The fragments found in Hampi, which I think would definitely benefit from further research. Fritware fragments. I mean, we know that tiles do appear in Hindu contexts in India, in obviously Gwalior and Bundelkhand, but not anything is really known about tiles in Hampi. And it's quite possible there are a few Muslim tombs which haven't been fully investigated, and these tiles, which bear quite a resemblance to the Bahmani tiles, may have come from the tomb, but from one of those tombs, but we just don't know enough. These are in the V&A and were found allegedly in the environs of a palace, but not specified where, in 1914. But John Fritz and George Michel, who of course are the real experts on Hampi, have found one or two other fragments in the course of their research, but not a great deal. Well, I was going to show another slide, but I think we better leave it there for now because I can't even get to it, and it was just an aside. So I think we'll leave it there, and then we can have a few discussions and questions.
So thank you so much, Arthur. I'm so sorry about some of the technical difficulties that we were having, but I think we managed to see some really, really beautiful tiles and get some really excellent discussion from you about these tiles. I just wanted to ask, open up the discussion to our audience. Everybody can sort of chime in with questions as they wish in the chat box. I was personally wondering, while you were speaking, just to ask a first question about what we know about the specific tile makers, the koshikars, these, were they, some of the ideas that you were sharing resonated with me as far as, I work on manuscripts. So I was thinking about manuscript makers. Who are these people? Where are they coming from? How are they sort of, who's responsible for this work? And that's one question that I have. And really whether or not we can tell anything about where particular tiles were made based on materials. So for example, you had mentioned the styles of particular tiles that were made in Tapta or Multan, but really, is there anything besides style that we can rely on in order to figure out where exactly a tile may have been made? That's all the questions that I will ask you, and then we'll get to our audience. Thank you so much.
Well, that's a pleasure. We know really very little about, for certain, about where they were made. And I think this is going to be a very important avenue of research because, we can learn a lot from technical analysis, and it's becoming more and more sophisticated. There's been quite a lot of work done on the fabric of tiles in the north of India and in Pakistan. Maninder Singh Gill, who I think is with us today, has done a lot of work, and one or two other people as well, on the analysis of the material. But as Helen was saying earlier on, there's really no sign of kilns or anything, so it's all quite mysterious. I mean, the problem is that there's so many layers of history and things have got obliterated that we just we've got very little to go on. So obviously the style of the tiles is the biggest clue we have. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the first bit of the question, which was rather interesting. Your first half, can you just remind me?
Related to that question, and actually I see right now that Susan Bean, hello Susan, has asked a similar question about the makers of these tiles, the identity of the people who were making them, whether, for example, in the tomb of Ahmed Shah, we have a signature of a particular, I think is the Nisbas Kazvini, but does that really tell us anything about his affiliation, where he comes from? And so I'm wondering from your research whether there's anything that tells us about the makers. Could not the tile makers in Gaur or Bengal be from that region, whereas some of these underglazed tiles that we're seeing, they may be made by Iranians and shipped abroad, or so I'm really interested in this because tiles, especially for 15th century scholarship, is such an exciting and quite an important avenue of research, especially in thinking of Gulru Najibolu's really important article on the Timurid International and tiles. So I'm really wondering whether or not the Deccan can be inscribed directly within this sort of network of places where tiles may have been exported. So that's really a number of questions for you to think about.
Yes, well, I mean, the answers are few and far between, but I think, the Persian craftsmen are definitely involved.
Right.
I think we can assume that, but whether, I don't actually think necessarily that the tiles were imported. I think it's probably much more likely that the craftsmen came there, because it would have been very difficult and expensive to import tiles. And also I'm just from my very non-technical observation of the tiles there, that the fabric is is a bit different from tiles in Iran, just subtly different, and it does look like the material is that they've been made perhaps a little bit more crumbly, the material that you get in India and in the Deccan. Just the other point is that lots of different types of specialists were involved in producing these tiles. We have the designer of the building, and then we have the calligraphers who played, of course, a very important role in the inscriptional tiles. And then we've got the actual technical people, and they were all. It was very much a collaboration, and I think it's very difficult to sort of pick out where these people came from. But I think for certain foreigners were involved, probably Iranians, and for certain locals were involved. One rather interesting thing on the facade of the Madrasa of Mahmud Gawan is you do notice that the underglaze painted tiles, they're not a standard size. Every single tile is different. And I think this means that to make those tiles in another country and bring them to India would have been just too complicated for words. And I think they must have been made very locally, because it would have just been, it would have been a nightmare to untangle the positioning of each tile, because they're not one of them matches. And when you look at the imprints on the wall, it's fascinating. And I couldn't really quite see why. I mean, you'd have thought the natural inclination would be to make tiles of identical size, but that's not what they've done.
Helen, do you have a question?
Yes. Can I ask you about the red color that is so dominant, especially on the tiles that decorated the Divan-i-Am and were published by. We have, of course, Minai, which is very different, but we have, of course, as you mentioned, the Ottoman. But the Mamluks, when I was working on the tiles at the Benaki, on the ceramics at the Benaki, there were a number of Mamluk examples that precede or were exported to Cairo, that seem to have preceded the use of red that we know from the 16th century in Iznik. And as the more I look at the work and the designs that they have, I think that we have to start considering the possibility that the Mamluks were also involved, since they were trading partners, I think, in many ways with the Deccanis, because Mahmud Gawan and others really had representations in Cairo, encouraging, obviously, these commercial relations. And though I don't think it's Minai and I don't think it's Iznik, I think the fact that you have these small examples of red color, which is so difficult to produce on Mamluk ceramics, not tile ceramics. I was wondering whether, in fact, there's this possibility that, in fact, some of these came with craftsmen from the Mamluk kingdom.
Yes. I think it is quite possible. I mean, I should say, the Mamluk tiles I've seen with the red, it's sort of more of a sort of russety, browny color than the full red. But I mean, that may also be the case for these lost tiles in the Diwan-i-Am as well. I mean, Yazdani makes them look brilliant red, but they may well not have been red as that.
But but don't you think it also depends on the quality of the iron?
Yes.
And as India had so much, I mean, there were so many places where iron was produced. Perhaps the quality of their iron was much better than the other, and perhaps it's Indian iron that is responsible for the brighter red that we have later. I mean, there's a hypothesis, but I mean,
yes,
there are all these things that have to find solutions and answers. And of course, we don't know the answer to that, but simply we have to think about it as being something which, I think the Deccan was very much part, of the Timurid world, and very much part of the 15th century international Timurid world, and the 16th as well. So I think we can't isolate the Deccan from what was happening elsewhere.
No, and I mean, I should say that there are some red pigments appeared in Bengal as well. There's a fragment from the now lost tomb of Hussein Shah, I think, which there's a picture in the publication, I can't remember the name, which shows a very brilliant red. I mean, really comparable with Iznik red in Bengal. And then also there are some late Mughal tiles in Patna, in that some floor tiles in an 18th century small mosque, which have also got a sort of quite sort of reddish brown color as well. So it is around, but it does seem to have been something people struggled with because it's not that common. But I noticed that particularly in Mughal buildings, that red pigment is often just painted on plaster in the sort of adjacent to the tiles, as though this was an easier way of achieving the color.
No, the effect, yeah. I don't know. I think I can see Marika is asked.
Marika, would you like to ask your question by voice? She's asking about how the yellow color was achieved.
Well, it's a mix. I don't know exactly. Again, I mean, it'd be very interesting to actually analyze these glazes. And as far as I know, it hasn't been. But it's a mixture of tin, lead, and zinc, metallic oxides that produce the yellow. And I know that that analysis has been done in North India, and I forget the exact proportions, but yellow was produced with a mixture of those oxides.
We have another question about what makes Deccan tiles distinctive, but I wanted to ask you about regionality and tiles. So, the case of Thatta and Sindh is very interesting because clearly these tiles meant something, that they were circulating and being used in other buildings and sort of used as sort of a commodity of sorts, right? So I'm wondering, do you get a sense of any other sort of regional specificities about Deccan tiles or other regions within India? So, for example, Mandu or Malwa also has its own, I don't know whether we can call it a tradition, but it certainly has evidence of practice of tile making. Just a comment about the specificity of regions.
Yes, well, it's quite, I think, I mean, the thing about the Deccan is it is, as we've seen already, quite varied, and it is quite difficult to pin it down. I mean, I think, in Mandu, for example, there's a lot of similarities with tiles in Bidar, but I mean, I noticed, for example, in the cut tile mosaic fragments on one of the tombs, I forget which, in Mandu, you've got this very distinctive aubergine purple, which I don't think you see so much in the Deccan. And there are a few things like that which do vary. And of course, the two regions which really are completely on their own in terms of distinctiveness are the Indus region and Bengal, because they're very, there's absolutely no mistaking their own style and technique. But it's a bit more difficult to sort of pin down. I mean, the Mughals produced actually more limited Quer de Seca tiles than one would think, given what we see in museums in the West, which are quite a lot. But when you're actually there aren't that many examples. But Quer de Seca tiles certainly don't appear everywhere, and I think we could probably say that those are particularly associated with Mughal North India, specifically Shah Jahan's period.
So, Helen.
Yes, and I know that in his book, Mark Zabrowski mentioned the Quer de Seca technique, And Georgia as well repeated it in the book that they jointly authored. But I haven't seen a single cuerda seca technique tile before the Baridi period and the 16th century in Bidar. We've seen imitation cuerda seca where purple is occasionally used, but not, there's no division, this deep little rivulet of black that separates the colors. You said you really try to imitate, but in a different way. So, and that's another particularity, I think, of the Deccan from other regions of India, or even a later Deccan, late 16th century Deccan. So there are a number of ways that you can, but I think it's the interesting thing is that it shows so many contacts and relations, and we still are unable to define these in a solid way. I mean,
yes. Yes, no, I agree.
But thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Arthur, for this fantastic talk.
Thank you.
So please join me in thanking Arthur Milner for his lecture on tiles today.
Thank you.
I'm sorry it got off to a rather shaky start technically. But
it's perfectly fine. I promise you we'll edit out those technical details when we post this video. I'm sure the Bangalore International Center certainly will. But again, thank you so much. We will keep you posted on if and when we restart our seminar in the autumn. It's looking like we will because of the fantastic turnout that we've been getting and the desire for more knowledge about the Deccan and its art and culture. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next year, next academic year.
All
right. Yeah. All right.